We have, of course, been thinking about how to cover this conversation in a lot of New Mexico in Focus. We think you'll like what's next. Simon Romero is a national correspondent for the New York Times. He's a New Mexican by birth and has been covering immigration and other issues like upheaval in Brazil and Venezuela. Mr. Romero is back here now, where he closely follows the migrant surge along the U.S.-Mexico border for the Times. NMIF correspondent Russ Contreras spoke to him recently in our studio about the changing landscape of Latin American politics and the Latino legacy here in the Southwest.
Simon, thank you for joining us here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Almost as soon as you came back to New Mexico, you were covering the migrant surge along the border here. How is this migrant movement, how has it been different from other movement of refugees you've covered in Latin America?
Wow. Well, I've covered various migrant flows around the region in Latin America. You know, Haitians moving to Brazil across the Amazon, a lot of Colombian refugees in Venezuela, and then Venezuelans pouring out of Venezuela now, like into neighboring countries. And this one is different because, of course, it's happening on our border and in the part of the country that I'm from. So I have a sort of like a real personal connection to what's happening, and that, you know, that's different from covering a situation with some source of detachment that I may have had before. But it's been really fascinating and at the same time troubling to watch these events unfold on the border. I think that we in the media, and especially at the New York Times, we try to shed as much light as we can, in as objective and in as compassionate a way as possible, just to describe what's happening down there.
And who are these people in these migrant camps and shelters, and what is their journey like? You know,
this is a very different type of migration than we saw in this country just 2 or 3 or 5 years ago or a decade ago. These are nearly entirely families, so these are parents and often traveling with young children, or these are unaccompanied children, many of whom are young teenagers traveling on their own to try to make it to this country. They come predominantly from 3 countries in Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And they are seeking asylum here. They're requesting asylum in the United States, and they're doing that legally. And many of them claim that they're fleeing situations in their home countries, whether it's violence or political persecution, drug gangs, gang warfare, the types of things that just make their lives unbearable in the places that they're coming from.
The response from the federal government to the surge is fundamentally different than what's going on from local authorities. What is the difference? You've been on the ground. What is the motivating factor for the local response to the surge?
Well, it's really fascinating. In every single part of the border with Mexico, in every single congressional district, whether those are Democrats that hold those districts or the lone Republican in the case of West Texas, every single member of Congress opposes the proposal for a wall along the entire border. And I think that has to do with the perspective that they have and that people who live along the border have. Because they're from this region, they're used to migration already. Many people, their livelihood depends on trade with Mexico, cross-national trade, and they know the benefits of that. And they also know the cultural and historical legacies that, you know, the ways in which Mexico and the United States have come into contact with one another throughout the centuries. So people are aware of those ties, and they're not quite so xenophobic as people are elsewhere in this country.
One of the things that has surprised me among the migrants, you do have people from Central America, but you also have people from Cuba and Brazil, which is fascinating to a lot of people. What is bringing Brazilian refugees to places like Juarez?
Well, it's a stagnant economy, essentially, in Brazil. You know, Brazil went through this colossal, frenetic economic boom about a decade ago. And since then, the economy cooled off, and then it went over a cliff. So unemployment surged in Brazil. People all of a sudden found themselves out of work. Inflation is climbing. And also many cities in Brazil are very violent places. And people just see their best chances for survival and advancement to make this journey north. What's interesting about the Brazilians who are crossing the border, many of them are middle class or lower middle class, so they're not quite as poor as many of the other migrants, but they're still very desperate. They're desperate enough to have to come all this way and make that journey. Something ironic about what's happening with this Brazilian influx is that they're moving out of a country now that's led by a president who is extremely xenophobic and extremely antagonistic toward immigrants who have moved to Brazil. So it's sort of like this interesting disconnect between what the president of Brazil and his vitriol and the many Brazilians who are actually continuing to leave the country.
Now, you were in Brazil for 8 years as a reporter. You were in Venezuela for 5 years as a journalist there. And you covered political upheavals. Are you surprised about the upheaval we're seeing now in Venezuela and Brazil?
Really, not at all in Venezuela. It's the culmination of just year after year of mismanagement of the economy, of authorities trying to circumscribe the political opposition, of really the erosion of rule of law in Venezuela. And there have been various waves of protests over the years that have tried to do something about this, really to no avail. So people are really quite desperate. The situation is, economically speaking, is just out of control. Inflation is surging. There are food shortages, there are water shortages, there are blackouts. And so it's almost interesting that it's taken this long for events to really reach this kind of a tipping point in Venezuela.
And in Brazil too, with the new president too, as well.
That's right. He's a very divisive figure, and he's made a slew of racist, homophobic, misogynistic remarks. He's insulted people not just around Brazil, but around the world as well. And so there have been some really strong reactions to this inside Brazil, around Latin America, even in this country, in New York, where he's scheduled to be the honoree at the annual gala for the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. Turns out that the place that was going to host this event, the Museum of Natural History in New York, decided they didn't want anything to do with it. So it's interesting to see how he's being treated as a pariah in some places, actually.
And I remember a decade ago, the Christ statue was on the cover of the Economist, going up in the air, like as if Brazil's economy was taking off, saying that this was the new economic secret that people needed to invest in. And in fact, the writers were arguing that it has low corruption and high returns. This is what the narrative was like 10, 12 years ago. What happened? It seemed to have turned almost dramatically.
Yeah, it was incredible. I think really a lot of investors, especially foreign investors, got burned. And this has happened cyclically throughout Brazil's history. Brazil is a country that's reliant on exports of commodities. And those commodity prices, they go up, they go down, they fluctuate, and the fortunes of Brazil's economy really fluctuate with those commodity prices. And the issue of corruption was really interesting in that there was this perception that Brazil was less corrupt than some of its neighboring countries in the region, which just turned out to be false and misleading. There were incredible investigations into corruption at Brazil's national oil company at nearly every level of the federal government, also in corruption and graft on the state and municipal levels. And really, you can almost look at these inquiries into wrongdoing in a glass half full type of way, because this means that Brazil's judicial institutions are more robust than they were in the past, and that they're independent enough and resilient enough to carry out these investigations. Now, there's a whole debate in Brazil as to whether they've gone too far or whether some of these investigations were politically motivated to target certain people who once held power. But it's been fascinating to watch it unfold, really.
But the bureaucracy is still the same. You need somebody to go file your driver's license and so forth like that.
Oh, the bureaucracy is just colossal. It's huge. Yeah, there's an institution in Brazil called the cartório, which is it's a type of notary public, and they charge just these extravagant amounts of money for very basic services, like getting a signature on a rental agreement certified and whatnot. And you always have to stand in line and wait and take a chunk out of your day and then pay them to do this. So those types of structural issues that Brazil has faced in the past are clearly still there, and it's not clear what the people in power are going to do about them.
Since coming back to New Mexico, some of the stories you've touched on cover history in New Mexico. And of course, this is an area with a deep historical past. You've covered a story that caught a lot of attention connecting our past to slavery and the Hispanic role in slavery, even challenging the narrative about us having a Spanish ethnicity in its past. Why are those stories important, and why do they attract you?
You know, well, first of all, I mean, I grew up in northern New Mexico and outside of Las Vegas, and one of the most really one of the most thrilling classes I've ever taken, whether in grade school or middle school or college or beyond, was a high school class that was at West Las Vegas High, and it was on New Mexico history, and it just captivated me. So it got me hooked on New Mexico's own incredible past and just in history in general, and that's what I went on to study as an undergrad. And so I just find history illuminating, and especially the history of this region. You know, we grew up there with that myth that, oh, we're Spanish or we're pure perhaps, and the truth is always more complex and more complicated than that. And I love those stories, really drilling down and investigating and reflecting on the incredible work that many historians do in this area. And with that story on the Genízaros, on the you know, it's proven now that many of us here are descended from enslaved Native Americans who were brought up in Hispanic families, and this happened for a long time in what's now the American West. And so I just thought that was a way into telling our story from a different kind of perspective. And it was, you know, coincidentally a big hit with our audience, not just in the U.S. but globally. I mean, a lot of people find those historical takes on stories to be really interesting.
And what did your family tell you? Did they tell you too that you were descendant of Spanish conquistadors? Yeah.
You know, some of them did, of course, and I still have family members who describe themselves as Spanish, and they're going to be Spanish forever. And I think we all have a right to call ourselves what we want to call ourselves. I'm not going to dictate to anyone whether they're right or wrong. But yeah, we grew up with a combination of different descriptions going on in our family. And I mean, our roots are here in New Mexico, like many other people, and we just go back a long, long way.
You know, of course, as returning to Mexico and reporting, you've covered some interesting stories that were very painful when they came on the page. I'm talking about your pieces on the American West and violence against Mexican Americans and Latinos that were here. What attracted you to that story, and what was your reaction?
Well, I really find stories that involve some aspect of what we might call hidden history, or you know, facts, historical developments that people really aren't aware of for some reason. Maybe it's because these things were brushed under the rug, or they weren't taught in our schools for so long, or they just don't really fit into nicely with the historical narrative that, say, you know, a big state like Texas has about itself, the way that Texas teaches its own history in its textbooks. And so a story about all of these lynchings that went on of Hispanics across the West, and I mean in Texas and California largely, but also a lot in Arizona, Colorado, and even here in New Mexico. We had a lot of lynchings here. And it just is a way to reflect on, you know, how political power was first structured, I think, after the U.S. conquest of much of the West. And there were obviously like struggles for power and struggles for land. And this was the way in which many people were forced off their land and forced to give it up to new owners. They were chased off, or they were, you know, mobs came after them. So it's one of those stories that really seemed to strike a nerve with people.
And what was the reaction from folks that read it? I mean, of course, in New Mexico and places like Texas, you're going to get a reaction saying, no, I've never heard of this, this can't be true. Did you get any of that?
Yeah, so many people said that. I never knew this happened in my own backyard, or I didn't know we actually had a lynching in Farmington, New Mexico. Many people in California were unaware of the the surge in mob violence against people of Mexican descent right after the U.S. took control of California during the gold rush. There was just this huge amount of lynchings that took place out there. So it was just interesting to hear from so many people who had never seen all of this kind of pulled together in one way. And of course, I was relying hugely on the very valuable work done by historians and other scholars in this area. It's just fascinating to see research into that aspect of our history, taking off in this new direction. So, but it was just incredible how many people were surprised to hear about these very recent events that happened, and sometimes in our own cities.
Now, since you've gone all around the Western Hemisphere, now you're back in New Mexico home, do you find the stories that you cover more personal now? Because you're actually in the land of your birth, the land of your family's birth. Is there something that connects you to some of these pieces?
Definitely. There's almost more of a visceral feeling sometimes covering certain issues, and that can be challenging because we have to approach what we're covering with as much objectivity, with as much fairness, with as much transparency as possible. So luckily I have great editors back in New York who I'm constantly in touch with and in dialogue with about how to cover a certain story and how to do it right and how to do it ethically and how to do it completely. But I definitely feel more strongly about certain issues because they're happening here where my family lives, where they've lived for centuries, really. For instance, I was just down on the border last week writing about this militia group that emerged down in Sunland Park, right on the outskirts of El Paso. But of course, this is in New Mexico. And they were filming their own actions, going out there and detaining families of migrants coming over. And so it was interesting, actually, to cover that story in New Mexico because the reaction by authorities here stood really in sharp contrast to the way that elected officials, say in Arizona or say in Texas, how they reacted to these militia groups coming in and setting up camp. I think there's been more tolerance of those groups in those places than there might be here in New Mexico, which just makes it a really interesting thing to cover.
Was New Mexico different than when you left it?
New Mexico is different and it's the same, and that's a wonderful question. One of the things I love about this place is the timelessness of it, and just the open spaces and the sense of freedom, the big skies, how relaxed it is, how relaxed a political culture it is also, I find really interesting. In some ways, it's changed, and not for the better, though. Economically, it's been pretty stagnant, and I think that's a really tough challenge for leaders in this state to decipher and to address. So it's just been a fascinating re-entry into New Mexico. But I just love being back. I don't know. There's something about the place that I just feel a real connection to, and. I just love being able to ride in my truck around northern New Mexico, listen to music, and it's almost meditative compared to driving in big Latin American cities.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Russell, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.